There are 3 tons of gold sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic, guarded by corpses who still clutch their teacups from the Titanic's last breakfast. Everyone knows that story. But what they don't tell you is that 4,000 miles west, in a darkness so complete it has weight, something far more valuable lies waiting, not treasure but terror. Nuclear warheads, Soviet cipher machines, and the bodies of 98 men who took their country's secrets to a grave no shovel could ever reach. It's 1968, and somewhere between Hawaii and Midway, the Pacific swallows K-129 whole. No distress signal, no survivors, just silence, the kind that makes admirals wake up sweating in the night. The submarine vanishes as if it never existed, as if the Cold War itself reached down with frozen fingers and erased it from the world. Imagine that moment, the instant the hull buckles under 3 miles of ocean, steel screaming as it crumples like paper in God's fist. The lights go out. The water rushes in. And in that final second, those sailors know with absolute certainty that no one will ever find them. But someone does. The ocean floor is not a graveyard, it's a library, and the United States has just learned to read in the dark. Flash forward 6 years. The rain comes down in sheets on the deck of the Hughes Glommer Explorer, each drop hitting like a tiny accusation against the steel. This ship shouldn't exist. Howard Hughes, the billionaire recluse who hasn't been seen in public for years, supposedly built it to mine manganese nodules from the seabed. That's the story anyway. That's what the newspapers print, what the company's PR department swears is true, what the longshoremen in Long Beach tell their wives when they come home smelling of diesel and salt. They're all lying. The truth tastes different. It tastes like fear wrapped in money, like ambition dressed up as patriotism, like the kind of secret that costs more than most countries' GDP. The Hughes Glommer Explorer is the most expensive magician's prop ever built, a 300-foot vessel designed for a single trick: make a Soviet submarine appear from the abyss. Project Azorian. Even the name sounds like it belongs to something that doesn't want to be found, something ancient and submerged. Captain Harlan stands at the rail, watching the rain dissolve into the Pacific. His face has that particular weathering that comes from too many years staring at horizons, too many secrets carried in the space behind his ribs. Former Navy, Vietnam veteran, now CIA, though he never uses those letters aloud. His hands grip the salt-slick metal, knuckles white despite the tropical heat that makes the rain feel like standing under a warm faucet. Behind him, the deck crew moves like phantoms through the downpour, faceless in their rain gear, checking cables that disappear over the side and down into water so deep that fish there have evolved without eyes. What's the point of sight in a world made entirely of crushing darkness? "Coffee's shit again," says Miller, the young engineer joining him at the rail. Kid can't be more than 25, fresh from MIT with a head full of hydraulics and differential equations. He hasn't learned yet that some problems can't be solved with math. You'd think with a $1 billion budget we could afford decent beans. Harlan doesn't look at him. You think we're just salvaging metal. The rain intensifies, drumming a rhythm on the deck that sounds almost like Morse code if you listen right. ... SOS maybe, or maybe that's just what men hear when they spend too long above drowned things. "Sorry." "Nah, kid," Harlan's voice comes out gravelly, eroded. "We're dredging up the devil's own diary." Below them, in the moon pool, that eerie circular opening in the ship's center where ocean swirls up through the hull like the pupil of some giant eye, the claw waits. They call it Clementine because someone in Langley has a sense of humor about excavating the dead. It's a magnificent horror, a mechanical hand 60 feet wide, strong enough to grip a submarine and gentle enough not to crush it. Theoretically. The engineers swear their calculations are sound, but there's a tremor in their voices when they talk about it, a hesitation that suggests they know mathematics is just another form of prayer. The hydraulic pumps begin their song, a low, thrumming pulse that vibrates through the deck plates and into Harlan's bones. It sounds like a heartbeat, not human, something older, something that predates lungs and warm blood back when the first creatures crawled from the ocean and thought they'd escaped. They hadn't escaped. The sea doesn't forget, it just waits. "Deployment in 30 minutes, crackles the intercom, and the crew shifts into action with practiced efficiency. They've been training for months at a dummy site, lowering and raising weighted barrels, perfecting the choreography of pulling ghosts from the deep. But training is different when there aren't 98 corpses watching from the dark. Miller shifts beside him, nervous energy making him tap his fingers against the rail. You ever wonder about them? The Russian crew, I mean, think they knew what was coming. Harlan finally turns to look at the kid, really look at him. Sees the unlined face, the curiosity not yet calcified into cynicism, the belief that questions have answers and answers have meaning. I hope not, he says quietly. I hope it was fast. The rain begins to ease, transitioning from downpour to drizzle, and through the thinning veil of water, the moon pool glows with underwater lights, and luminous circle of impossible green in the surrounding darkness. The cables attached to Clementine sing as they take up tension, a high, keening note that could be wind or metal or something in between. Something that sounds, if you let your imagination run, like voices. Like 98 voices, 3 miles down, whispering fragments of final prayers in Russian. The claw begins its descent. But to understand what it's reaching for, you have to rewind the tape. Go back 6 years, March 1968. The Pacific is cold that month, colder than it should be, as if the ocean itself senses what's coming. K-129, a Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine, designation Whiskey in NATO's alphabet of dread, is somewhere northwest of Hawaii running quiet on patrol. 70 men in the crew. Another 28 specialists for the missile systems. All of them breathing recycled air that tastes like metal and fear, the way all submarine air does after weeks submerged. And then, nothing. Accounts differ on what happened next, the way truth always fractures when it hits pressure. Some say the batteries exploded, chemical fires turning the submarine into an oven that cooked men alive in their bunks. Others whisper about a missile malfunction, fuel igniting in the launch tube, blowing the hull open from the inside. The Soviets, when they finally acknowledged the loss years later, offered only bureaucratic vagaries, catastrophic failure, as if language could soften the image of steel crumpling like foil under millions of tons of water. What's certain, the submarine died screaming. 16,000 feet, that's how far it fell. Imagine that descent, the sub tumbling through absolute darkness, its hull already breached, water rushing through corridors where men had walked just moments before. The reactor's hum fading to silence. Emergency lights flickering once, twice, gone. And those final seconds when the crew, still conscious enough to understand, knew, with crystalline clarity, that this was how their story ended. Not in glory or combat, but in an unmarked patch of ocean that wouldn't even remember their names. The Soviets searched. Of course they searched. Destroyers and submarines carving grid patterns across the Pacific, sonar pinging into the deep like questions that would never be answered. For weeks they looked and found nothing. How could they? The ocean is vast and hungry and keeps its secrets well. After a month, the official search was called off. Privately, it continued for years. Ghost missions launched from Vladivostok, quietly desperate, always returning empty-handed. But the Americans knew. Those hydrophones, those underwater ears planted along the Pacific seabed like electronic sentinels, they heard everything. The explosion, the implosion, the final metallic groan as the submarine settled into its grave. Recordings that sat in NSA vaults for decades, classified not because they revealed American capabilities, but because listening to 98 men die is not something you share, even with allies. Especially with allies. In Moscow, in an apartment that smells of cabbage and old cigarettes, a woman named Irina sits by a window that overlooks a courtyard where children play in the snow. She's fictional, this Irina, but she's built from real testimonies, anonymous voices collected by researchers who knew to ask widows about their ghosts before the widows became ghosts themselves. Her fingers trace the edge of a photograph. Her husband in his naval uniform, young and proud, the way men look before war or the sea teaches them about impermanence. He promised the sea would bring him home, she says to no one, or perhaps to everyone who's ever waited for someone who won't return. Her Russian carries that particular melody of loss, each word weighted with months of staring at closed doors. But it kept him instead. She doesn't know, will never know, that her husband's submarine is about to become the most expensive salvage operation in human history. That in a Long Beach warehouse, Engineers are stress-testing a mechanical claw designed to hold his coffin. That the CIA, under Director Richard Helms, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, has already greenlit something called Project Azorian with a budget that makes Apollo missions look like weekend projects. The beauty of it, the terrible genius, is the cover story. Howard Hughes, the billionaire recluse who hasn't been photographed in years, supposedly decides to fund deep-sea mining operations. Manganese nodules, they claim, valuable minerals scattered across the Pacific floor like abandoned coins. It's ridiculous, it's perfect. Who would question an eccentric tycoon with money to burn on impossible ventures? The newspapers eat it up. Scientific journals publish articles about the commercial viability of oceanic mineral extraction. And beneath this theater of respectability, the Hughes Glommer Explorer is being retrofitted with equipment that has nothing to do with mining and everything to do with resurrection. Ah, the irony! How the pursuit of knowledge in those shadowed years often unearthed more ghosts than answers. The Cold War wasn't fought only with missiles and ideology, it was fought with lies so intricate they became their own kind of truth. A fake mining operation to hide a real submarine heist. A billionaire's name used like a magician's cape, concealing the hand that reached into the pocket of history itself. And what were they hoping to find down there, really? The nuclear missiles, certainly. Launch codes that might reveal Soviet targeting strategies. Cipher machines that could crack open years of encrypted communications. But there's something else, isn't there? Something darker and more human. They wanted to see inside the enemy's grave, to understand not just how the submarine died, but how the men aboard lived, what they thought in those final moments, whether their terror looked different from American terror. The documents, when they were declassified decades later, revealed almost nothing. Black bars across every interesting paragraph, redactions like missing teeth in a smile. But between the lines, if you knew how to read silences, you could sense the truth. This wasn't just espionage. It was necromancy, an attempt to make the dead speak secrets they'd carried to the bottom of the world. Back on the Hughes Glommer Explorer, Clementine descends through layers of ocean that have their own names, their own characteristics. Past the sunlight zone, through the twilight, into the midnight realm where bioluminescent creatures drift like stars in liquid night. And finally to the abyssal plain, that impossibly flat desert of silt where nothing grows and nothing changes except on geological timescales. The mechanical groan of the claw reaches upward through miles of water, a sound that seems less like machinery and more like grief made audible. But before Clementine ever touched ocean, it was born in fire. Rewind again, not years this time, but months. The Nevada desert, summer of 1973, where the air shimmers with heat that distorts everything, mirages that could be lakes or could be memories, depending on how long you've been staring. In a series of unmarked hangars outside a town too small to have secrets of its own, men are building the impossible. The official budget is classified, but whispers among congressional aides put it at $350 million. In today's dollars. North of $800 million. For comparison, that's enough to build a hospital in every major city in America. Instead, it's buying a single mechanical hand large enough to cradle a submarine. The claw, they call it Clementine, because gallows humor is the only kind that survives in places where failure means international incident, is 180 feet of hydraulic pipes and titanium pistons, each joint calibrated to within millimeters. It has to be strong enough to lift 5 million pounds. Gentle enough not to crush a hull that's already spent 6 years turning brittle under pressure. These specifications don't exist anywhere else in human engineering. They're inventing mathematics just to describe what they're attempting. Inside Hangar 7, the acrid scent of welding torches mingles with sweat and machine oil. Sparks fly in the darkness like fireflies that have forgotten how to rise, falling instead to the concrete floor where they die in tiny orange stars. The rhythmic thud of hammers echoes off metal walls, thud, 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 a percussion that sounds disturbingly like a submarine's propeller heard through water. The men working here don't talk about that. They don't talk about much, actually. Security clearances higher than gods, and NDAs that stretch into decades. Dr. Elias Grant stands before a blueprint spread across a table that's seen better years, his hands leaving coffee stains on corners that probably cost more to produce than his annual salary. He's 63, looks 80, chain smokes Camels like they're going to ban them tomorrow. Which, given how the Surgeon General's been talking lately, they might. His fingers, nicotine-stained, trembling slightly from too much caffeine or too many memories, trace the claw's hydraulic schematic. "We're not thieves, Harlan," he says without looking up, somehow sensing the captain's approach despite the cacophony around them. Grant's voice carries the particular rasp of a man who's inhaled too much smoke of various kinds. "We're archaeologists of the apocalypse, digging up what the world buried to forget." Harlan, visiting from the ship to oversee the final tests, steps closer. "Pretty words for grave robbing." "Pretty words are all we've got." Grant finally looks up, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. Behind the exhaustion is something else, a shadow that predates this project by decades. "You know what I did during the war, Los Alamos, I helped B-build." The stammer catches him the way it always does when he talks about that chapter. Takes a breath, tries again. "Built the physics package for Fat Man, watched it erase a city. Swore I'd never touch nuclear weapons again." "This is different." "Is it?" Grant's laugh is bitter as ash. "We're stealing Soviet warheads from the ocean floor. If even one of those missiles is still viable, if the recovery goes wrong," he doesn't finish. Doesn't need to. They both understand that the Pacific could become another kind of test site, this time by accident. The thing about Project Azorian that doesn't make it into the official histories is how much went wrong. Declassified files from the 90s hint at anomalies during testing, equipment failures that shouldn't have happened, given the redundancies built into every system, hydraulic pumps seizing for no discernible reason, computer systems crashing and rebooting with error codes that didn't match any known diagnostic. And then there were the reports, the ones that circulated among crew members in hushed tones over coffee. That had gone cold hours ago. Lights in the deep, not bioluminescence. The engineers knew what that looked like. These were different, geometric, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost like communication. One sonar operator swore he heard voices in his headphones during a test dive, whispering in Russian though the recording showed only static. He was quietly reassigned, not fired, not disciplined, just moved. The way inconvenient truths get moved in organizations that can't afford questions. The engineers tried to explain it away. Thermal vents creating optical illusions, equipment resonance producing auditory hallucinations, stress manifesting in pattern recognition where no patterns existed. Maybe, or maybe the ocean doesn't like being robbed even when the treasure is already dead. 3 weeks before the actual recovery attempt, tensions aboard the Hughes Glommer Explorer reached a breaking point. Below decks, in a corridor that smelled of diesel and desperation, voices rose above the ambient whir of winches. "This is insane," Miller, the young engineer, his MIT education suddenly worth less than his gut instinct. "The hydraulic tolerances are still off by 0.3%. That's enough to." "To what?" Another engineer, older, eyes hard with the knowledge that careers end when billion-dollar operations get delayed. "To fail. Everything could fail, kid. That's why we have backups, and backups for the backups." "But if the Claw C collapses under load," Grant stammered worse under stress, his hands shaking as he lit another Camel from the butt of the last. "We're not just losing the sub, we're announcing to Moscow exactly what we were trying to do, political apocalypse." Harlan stepped between them, his presence somehow quieting the argument without raising his voice. "We go in 48 hours, ready or not, those are the orders." And they did go. In 48 hours, the Hughes Glommer Explorer positioned itself above coordinates that had been triple-checked, cross-referenced with acoustic data, verified by satellite imaging that officially didn't exist. The Claw descended through darkness that had weight, past creatures that had never seen the sun, down to where pressure turns water into something almost solid. 3 miles, 4 hours of descent, and then through cameras that were essentially educated guesses about what could survive that depth, they saw it, the broken spine of K-129, half buried in silt, listing at an angle that suggested its final moments were not peaceful. The hull was breached in several places, metal peeled back like flesh from a wound. The Claw extended its fingers, mechanical, precise, and somehow gentle, reaching for a tomb that 98 men never expected anyone would find. On the ship above, the crew stood in silence, watching monitor screens that showed only shadows within shadows. But in that silence, someone thought they heard something through the hydrophones, a sound like breathing, like the ocean itself was holding its breath. July 1974. The coordinates read like a prayer no one wanted to answer. 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, where the Pacific stretches so vast it could swallow entire continents without notice. Here, the Hughes Glommer Explorer held position with thrusters that fought currents older than human memory, its hull rocking gently above a grave that had kept its secrets for 6 years. The moon pool gaped open at the ship's center, a portal to elsewhere, they called it in whispers. Stand at its edge and look down, and the water doesn't look like water anymore. It looks like liquid night, swirling and churning where floodlights tried and failed to penetrate more than a few feet. The air around it was thick, oppressive, carrying humidity that made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. Sweat didn't dry here. It just accumulated, dripping from chins onto deck plates that rang with each drop like tiny bells tolling for someone unnamed. Above the pool, the derrick's massive frame stretched upward into the tropical sky, its cables descending into darkness. 16,000 feet of steel rope, each section added with prayers to engineering gods that this would hold, that the mathematics were sound, that human ambition hadn't finally exceeded human capability. The pipe string groaned as it extended, a metallic symphony of stress and strain, each joint connection another mile closer to something that should have stayed buried. Tommy Reyes stood at the monitor station, his reflection ghosting over the grainy underwater footage. His hands wouldn't stop moving, adjusting knobs that didn't need adjusting, checking readouts he'd already memorized, anything to occupy fingers that wanted to tremble. 28 years old and he was watching history happen, or maybe watching history be stolen. Hard to know which. His father would have known. Papa had that kind of clarity about right and wrong, forged in the crucible of Cuban exile, shaped by October nights in '62 when the world held its breath waiting to see if missiles would fly. Sometimes, the pursuit of stars above blinds us to the monsters below, Tommy muttered, not realizing he'd spoken aloud until Grant turned to look at him. Your old man tell you that? Not in so many words, but yeah. Tommy's eyes stayed fixed on the monitors. He used to say we spent so much money reaching for the moon, we forgot to watch our own shadows. Grant lit another cigarette despite the no smoking signs plastered everywhere. Smart man, the moon doesn't shoot back. The cameras mounted on Clementine transmitted images that seemed to arrive from another dimension. Grainy, flickering, distorted by pressure and distance into something almost dreamlike. Silt clouds billowed across the frame like desert sandstorms in reverse, revealing glimpses of twisted metal that glinted dully in the claw's floodlights. The submarine's bow section emerged from sediment grain by grain, its hull plates bent at angles that spoke of violent death, sudden and absolute. Feel that vibration, Doc? Tommy's voice carried an edge he didn't recognize as his own. It's not just the engines, it's the dead knocking, asking why we're disturbing their sleep. The words hung in the humid air like smoke. Nobody laughed. Nobody even acknowledged them. Because they all felt it, that subsonic tremor running through the deck plates, rhythmic and wrong, like something vast and buried was stirring beneath them. The hydraulic systems hissed and spat as Clementine's fingers extended, each massive digit moving with surgical precision despite the crushing pressure. On the monitors, the claw descended those final meters in eerie silence. The cameras couldn't capture sound, so the crew watched a mime show of metal approaching metal, reaching. Contact! The jolt ran through every cable, every joint, every weld on the ship. A sound like a church bell struck underwater resonated up from the depths, followed by something worse, a grinding, tearing noise that made dental work feel pleasant by comparison. The wreck shifted. Sediment exploded outward in slow-motion plumes, revealing more of the submarine's fractured spine. And then they saw what the ocean had been hiding. The bow section, roughly 1/3 of the submarine, emerged from the silt like a breaching whale, except whales are meant to surface and this thing never would be. The retrieval would later be classified as partial success in clinical CIA language, but there was nothing partial about what the cameras showed. 6 bodies. That's what the reports would eventually confirm, decades later when some documents finally saw daylight. 6 sailors who had somehow been preserved by the cold and pressure, their remains trapped in compartments that had sealed during the sub's death throes. But before the clinical reports, before the autopsies and the diplomatic incidents, there was this moment. personal effects tumbling from breached compartments as the claw tightened its grip. A boot, its leather somehow intact, drifting down into the silt. A watch, its hands frozen at 8:40, the exact moment one man's time ended. And there, caught in Clementine's floodlights, a locket on a broken chain, spinning slowly in the current, its clasp sprung open to reveal a photograph so faded by seawater it had become a ghost of a ghost. Tommy stared at that locket until his eyes burned. Whose face was in there? Whose love had been carried 3 miles down into darkness? The hydrophones crackled with static. Then, cutting through the white noise like a knife through fog, came a sound that stopped every conversation on the ship. Voices, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human, speaking Russian. The words weren't clear, couldn't be clear through all that water and machinery, but the tone was pleading, desperate. P.O.M. Audacious. Help! Harlan's hand moved to the intercom so fast it was almost violent. Bring her up. All hands, initiate recovery sequence. Now. But the hydraulics screamed in protest, cables singing notes they were never designed to hit. And on the monitors, something in the submarine's interior moved where nothing should have been capable of movement. The forgotten whispers had found their voice, and they were asking questions no one on the Hughes Glommer Explorer knew how to answer. The ascent took 17 hours. 17 hours of cables screaming under loads they were never meant to bear, of hydraulic systems pushed past every safety margin, of men watching gauges climb into red zones and staying there, quivering like hearts about to burst. And through it all, those voices on the hydrophones, sometimes clear enough to make out syllables, sometimes just the suggestion of human sound beneath the mechanical chorus, but always there, always asking. When the wreck finally breached the surface of the moon pool, it came up like something birthed from nightmare rather than salvaged from history. Water cascaded off the fractured hull in sheets that caught the spotlights and threw them back as liquid silver, a waterfall in reverse, gravity confused about which way was up. The bow section, what remained of it, hung suspended in Clementine's grip, barnacles thick as armor plate covering every surface, rust bleeding through in streaks that looked disturbingly like old blood. The crew had gathered along the gantry rails, every man who could spare a moment from his post drawn to witness this. They stood in silence, hard hats tilted back, faces washed pale by the harsh fluorescence. The smell hit them all at once, that particular rotting ocean reek of things that should have stayed deep, brine and decay, and something metallic underneath, like copper pennies dissolving on the tongue. Harlan descended the ladder to the moon pool floor slowly, his joints protesting each rung, 54 years old and feeling every one of them. His boots hit the wet deck with a sound that echoed too long in the cavernous space. Around him, water dripped from 100 surfaces, each drop finding its own note, creating a percussion that sounded less like machinery and more like something ancient. A dirge, maybe. The kind sailors sang when they buried their own at sea. He approached the wreck with something like reverence or dread, hard to tell the difference in moments like this. His hand reached out before his brain gave permission, fingers finding the submarine's skin beneath the barnacles. Cold. So impossibly cold that it seemed to pull heat from his body, drawing it down into metal that had spent 6 years learning what absolute cold meant. Under his palm, he could feel the pitting where pressure had worked on the steel, grain by grain, molecule by molecule, dissolving certainty into approximation. "Look at her, boys." His voice came out rougher than intended. Ed cracking at the edges. "Not just steel and secrets, it's a coffin we pried open, and God help us if something followed it up." Oh, how the mighty machines of war reduced to whispers, he thought but didn't say. How quickly empire rusts. There had been a time, Korea, a lifetime ago, when Harlan had watched a destroyer take a mine amidships, watched it fold like paper in a fist, watched men who'd been laughing 5 minutes earlier turn into screaming shapes in burning oil. He'd survived that by seconds, by inches, by the cosmic coin flip that decides who goes home and who stays in the water forever. Looking at K-129 now, he felt the same vertigo, the same sense that death was a patient creditor who never forgot a debt. "Captain," Tommy's voice, small and tight. The young engineer had descended the ladder behind him, but Harlan hadn't heard. "Captain, we're finding things." "Show me." They moved to where a team was carefully extracting materials from the accessible compartments. Codebooks, their pages transformed into solid blocks of pulp and salt. Torpedoes, inert but intact, their serial numbers carefully logged for intelligence purposes. Navigation charts that dissolved into mush when touched. And then, in a sealed section aft of the forward torpedo room, the bodies. 6 of them? The reports would eventually say 6, though the exact number was classified for decades, reduced to blacked-out lines in documents released to the public in fragments, truth dispensed like medicine in doses too small to cure anything. 6 Soviet sailors who had died doing their duty, whose names would be buried under secrecy classifications deeper than any ocean trench, whose families would spend lifetimes not knowing whether to grieve or hope. The Americans buried them at sea 3 days later. A ceremony the CIA filmed but never released, a ritual performed with stolen Soviet flags purchased through back channels, with a Russian Orthodox prayer read phonetically by a Protestant chaplain who stumbled over the Cyrillic like a man walking through darkness. They committed the bodies to the Pacific with honors because even enemies deserve that much. Even secrets need grace. But before the burial there was this: the moon pool at midnight, the recovery complete, the wreck secured, and Tommy Reyes sitting on a coil of rope with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with something between exhaustion and breakdown. Dr. Grant found him there, offered him a cigarette which Tommy refused, then sat beside him in the posture of men who have learned that sometimes presence is all the help anyone can offer. "My father said I'd be building bridges," Tommy whispered. "That engineering was about connecting things, making the world smaller, bringing people together." Grant took a long drag, exhaled toward the ceiling where shadows moved in the harsh lights like they were alive. "Maybe we are, just different kind of bridges, the kind between the living and the dead." "That's not what he meant." "No, it's not." Grant's hand found Tommy's shoulder, gripped it once. "But it's what we've got." The tech anomalies started that night. Equipment failing for no reason, cameras showing static, then images that couldn't be real, spectral faces in feedback loops that engineers swore were impossible. Electromagnetic interference spiking in patterns too regular to be random, too irregular to be deliberate. Some said it was the submarine's reactor, still radiating faintly, its particles disrupting sensitive electronics. Others, the ones who'd heard those voices on the hydrophones, weren't so sure. Harlan stood at the moon pool's edge as the heavy steel doors began their closing sequence, hydraulics sighing like some great beast settling down to sleep. Through the narrowing gap, he could see the Pacific stretching to the horizon, dark, infinite, keeping its remaining secrets close. The bow section sat in its cradle behind him, dripping, silent, a fragment of history rescued from oblivion. But fragments are dangerous things. They have sharp edges. They cut when you try to make them whole. And somewhere in the recovered debris, among the corroded instruments and waterlogged documents, among the personal effects that would never find their way home, the forgotten whispers waited. Not in the submarine itself, but in what it represented, in what it proved, that the ocean remembers everything we try to bury, that the past is never past, just sleeping, that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The moon pool sealed with a final pneumatic hiss, trapping something inside that felt less like victory and more like a question that would haunt them all for years. What else came up with the wreck that they couldn't see? The answer arrived in the form of lights on the horizon. 3 days into the recovery, the bridge of the Hughes Glommer Explorer became a theater of controlled panic. Radar screens pulsed with blips that shouldn't have been there, Soviet trawlers, at least 4 of them, their positions forming a loose perimeter around the American vessel like wolves circling wounded prey. Through rain-smeared windows, their lights winked in the darkness, neither approaching nor retreating, just watching. Always watching. "They know," Miller said, his voice flat with the resignation of a man who'd always suspected this moment would come. "They've known the whole damn time." Harlan stood at the center of it all, hands braced against the chart table, studying positions that told a story he didn't want to read. The Soviets had spy ships, AGIs they called them, vessels disguised as fishing trawlers but bristling with electronic surveillance equipment that could intercept conversations from miles away. How long had they been listening? What had they heard? "Do they know what we have?" he asked. "Does it matter?" Grant appeared at his elbow, Ashef. Ram, his cigarette dropping unnoticed onto the charts. They know we're here, they know something's in our hold, the rest is just details. Details. As if the details weren't everything. As if the difference between suspicion and confirmation wouldn't reshape the entire geopolitical landscape. This was the razor's edge the Cold War walked. Not knowing was sometimes safer than knowing, because knowledge demanded response, and response risked escalation into places no one wanted to go. The storm hit just after midnight, as if the Pacific itself had decided to weigh in on the theft taking place above its floor. Waves mountainous and black crashed against the explorer's hull, sending shudders through steel that had been engineered to withstand exactly this, but still seemed surprised by the ocean's fury. The alarm klaxon started as a low moan and built to a shriek, announcing what the crew already felt in their bones. Something was wrong. "Cable stress at 98%, someone shouted over the chaos. Section 12 showing metal fatigue. The crack came like a rifle shot, loud enough to be heard over the storm. Then another, and another. The cables holding Clementine's prize, the bow section they'd fought so hard to bring up, began to fail. Dr. Elias Grant stood in the moon pool chamber, surrounded by engineering diagrams that had become meaningless the moment theory met the rage of reality. His hands shook as he lit another camel from the butt of the last, chain-smoking through calculations that refused to add up. Around him, emergency lights cast everything in hellish red, shadows jumping with each roll of the ship. "We thought we could play God, Harlan," he said when the captain appeared beside him, both of them staring up at the straining cables. "Snatching fire from the deep, but fire burns and the sea, it remembers." His voice carried something beyond exhaustion, a kind of spiritual weariness, the recognition that some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend politics or patriotism. They'd crossed one of those boundaries, and now the bill was coming due. "Can we stabilize it?" Harlan asked, though he already knew the answer from Grant's expression. "Tommy's working on it, but if this thing breaks," the stammer worse under stress, fear manifesting in the muscles of speech. "It's not just metal falling, it's our souls with it. Everything we thought we were doing, all the justifications, they go down too." Ah, the irony. How the Cold War's greatest triumphs and deepest shames were often the same event, depending on which side of history's curtain you stood. Azorian had the audacity of Apollo, the vision of men who believed technology could solve problems that were fundamentally human. They'd reached for the moon and planted a flag there for all to see. They'd reached for the ocean floor and planted. What? A question mark. A secret that would take decades to partially declassify, and even then would emerge redacted, incomplete, a story told in whispers and omissions. The cables screamed. Metal under stress sounds like nothing else, a high-frequency keen that bypasses ears and goes straight to the animal brain, triggering every instinct that says run, flee, survive. Tommy and his team worked with desperate precision, adjusting tensions, redistributing loads, fighting physics with nothing but training and hope. "She's slipping," someone yelled, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, they watched the submarine fragment tilt in its cradle. Water that had been trapped in interior compartments suddenly gushed out through rents in the hull, and with it came a mist that seemed wrong somehow, too thick, too cold, carrying a smell like ancient ice and regret. In that mist, men swore later they saw faces. 92 souls who'd gone down with the stern section, the two-thirds of K-129 that had broken free during the lift and tumbled back into the abyss, taking most of the valuable intelligence with it. The official reports never mentioned this detail, the catastrophic failure that transformed Azorian from triumph into expensive question mark. But the men who were there, who felt the cables snap and heard the groaning descent of metal into darkness, they knew. Success and failure had become impossible to separate, twisted together like the cables themselves. A recovered letter found in a waterproof pouch in one sailor's pocket made its way eventually to the CIA's translation department. It was addressed to someone named Irina, maybe the same Irina who sat in Moscow tracing photographs, maybe not. The letter spoke of homesickness and duty, of a daughter's birthday missed and promises to make it up. It ended with a line that the translator noted was surprisingly poetic. "The sea is patient, she waits for all of us." The translation was filed, classified, and forgotten in vaults, where forgotten things go to wait their turn at relevance. On the bridge, as the storm's fury began to exhaust itself into ordinary tempest, Harlan made the decision that would define the rest of his career and haunt the rest of his nights. Secure what remains. Stabilize. Survive. Get this ship and its secrets back to port before the Soviets decided watching wasn't enough. Can neither confirm nor deny, the CIA spokesman would say years later when asked about Project Azorian, coining a phrase that would enter the American lexicon as the Glommer response. A legal dodge that became its own kind of truth, an admission through denial, a secret kept by acknowledging the impossibility of keeping it. But that was later. Now, in this moment, there was only the storm subsiding into rain, the Soviet ships maintaining their vigil, and the Hughes Glommer explorer turning slowly toward home with a hold full of ghosts and questions that weighed more than any metal. The whispers that had crescendoed into a roar softened now into something else. Not silence, never silence, but a melancholic hum that would follow these men for the rest of their lives. The sound of the deep breathing, the sound of secrets that refused to stay buried, no matter how many fathoms of water pressed down upon them. August 1975. The Hughes Glommer explorer returned to port with a hold full of fragments and questions. The official accounting, when it finally emerged decades later in documents stamped with enough classification marks to make them look like abstract art, told a story of partial success. Valuable intelligence recovered on Soviet nuclear capabilities, torpedo designs reverse-engineered, codebooks that opened windows into enemy communications. But the bulk of K-129, two-thirds of the submarine, the section holding the most crucial secrets, had broken free during the lift and tumbled back into the abyss, taking with it the very things the operation had been designed to retrieve. Was it success? Was it failure? The answer depended on who was asking and what they needed to believe. The CIA claimed victory in press releases that wouldn't be written for 35 years. The Soviets claimed nothing, maintaining a silence that was its own kind of statement. And the men who'd been there, who'd watched cables snap and heard those voices in the deep, they carried their own accounting in places words couldn't reach. Dawn on the Pacific has a quality that exists nowhere else. The mist rises from the water like exhaled breath, carrying with it the smell of salt and vast distances, of things that begin and end beyond human comprehension. On the Glommer's deck that final morning before docking, Harlan stood alone at the rail, watching light slowly define the boundary between sea and sky. Behind him, the ship's reactor hummed its constant note. Not the actual reactor, they'd shut that down hours ago, but the memory of it, the phantom vibration that lives in your bones after months at sea. He was 54 and felt ancient. Not old, ancient. Like he'd been alive for epochs rather than decades, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires carved from ice and ideology. His hands on the rail were steadier than they'd been during the recovery, but that was just the body's lie. Inside, he was still shaking. Sometimes, he said to no one, or perhaps to everyone who wasn't there, the deepest dives aren't into water, but into what we've buried in ourselves. The words felt right and wrong in equal measure, too poetic for a man who'd spent his life dealing in practical matters, too true to be dismissed as sentiment. What had they buried out here? Not just a failed recovery operation or a diplomatic incident that never quite became an incident. They'd buried the illusion that secrets could be kept, that the ocean gave up its dead willingly, that stealing from the abyss came without a price written in a currency that had nothing to do with dollars or rubles. Tommy found him there an hour later, brought him coffee that had gone lukewarm in the journey from galley to deck. They stood together in silence because some things had moved beyond the reach of language. The young engineer had aged during this voyage in ways that couldn't be measured in time. His eyes carried shadows now, the kind that never quite fade. "We won the heist, kid," Harlan said eventually, "but lost the war to forgetting." Years later, many years, enough that the Cold War itself had become a historical curiosity, a chapter in textbooks that made it all seem cleaner than it was, Captain Harlan would retire to a small house on the California coast. Not because he loved the ocean, but because he couldn't escape it. Every evening he'd sit on his porch and watch the Pacific swallow the sun, turning the water into liquid gold, then bronze, then that particular shade of darkness that holds all colors and none. People would ask him sometimes about Project Azorian, after the declassification in 2010 when suddenly everyone wanted to know about the submarine heist that sounded too fantastical to be real. He'd tell them the facts, the dates, the tonnage, the technical specifications, but he'd leave out the parts that mattered, the voices. The dreams that came afterward, dreams of drowning in air, of swimming through steel corridors where Russian sailors pointed at him with accusing fingers that were also sympathy, because they understood. They'd been asked to do impossible things for countries that would forget them too. "Did you succeed?" someone asked once, a journalist with a recorder running and ambition in her eyes. Harlan had thought about it for a long time, watching seabirds wheel over the surf. "We brought something up from the deep, whether that was what we went down for. I suppose that depends on what you think we were really looking for." It wasn't an answer, but it was the truth. In Moscow, in a reality that exists parallel to documented history, a woman named Irina, now elderly, her hair the color of winter, stands at the edge of the Moskva River with a handful of flowers. They're not much, just what she could afford on a pensioner's budget, but they're red like the flag that covered the coffin she never received, like the sunset that touched the Pacific the day her husband's submarine became a grave. She drops them one by one into the water, watches them drift and separate, carried by currents that will eventually reach the sea. "The sea took you," she whispers in Russian that the wind carries away. "But in stealing back your shadow they gave me peace, or perhaps just more ghosts. I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." The flowers spin and bob, moving with purpose toward some destination only the water knows. The men who served on Project Azorian scattered to their own lives, their own ordinary days, but they carried something back with them that wouldn't quite let go. Reports emerged over the years, never official, never documented in any file that bore a classification stamp, of crew members waking in the night to the sound of Russian voices, of seeing shadows that moved like men in submariner uniforms, of feeling suddenly, inexplicably cold in the middle of summer heat. Coincidence, surely, trauma manifesting as pattern recognition, the mind playing tricks in the space between sleep and waking, but coincidence is just another word for mystery we've decided not to interrogate. The Cold War ended, as all wars eventually do, with less a bang than a sigh of exhaustion. The giants who'd clashed in silence, through proxy battles and arms races and submarine heists from the ocean floor, they shrank back to human size, revealed as always to have been human all along. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved like salt in water. And Project Azorian became a footnote, an asterisk, a story that sounded too strange to be anything but true. But some things don't end just because the history books say they do. The wreck of K-129 still lies on the Pacific floor, two-thirds of it anyway, in darkness so complete it has mass. The 92 men who went down with the stern section are still there, waiting in the cold for a recovery that will never come. And somewhere in the vaults where secrets go to age like wine or spoil like milk, the full truth of what was found and what was lost continues to hide behind redactions thick enough to build walls from. Did we steal a submarine or merely awaken its specters? Maybe the question itself is the answer. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed and carried and passed down like folklore, like ghost stories told at the edges of campfires that have long since burned to ash. The ocean keeps its counsel. The deep holds its secrets. And if you stand at the shore on certain evenings when the wind is right and the light is failing, you might hear it. A sound like sonar, like a heartbeat, like a voice asking a question in a language that exists before words. One final ping, reaching across the years, dissolving into the vast and patient silence of 3 miles of water. An echo fading, but never quite gone.